To go. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So this is a conversation with pediatricians and families about the COVID-19 vaccine in adolescents. Any other questions you have about the COVID-19 vaccine in other age groups? We hope this is going to be a helpful conversation and a helpful experience for you all. So I wanted to introduce myself. My name's Dr. Becca Bell. I'm a pediatric ICU doctor, actually at UVM Children's Hospital in Burlington. And as for those of you who are just joining, I did teach at St. Johnsbury Academy many years ago. I taught science there, so I have some connection, not a total outsider. And I'm the president of the Vermont chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so pediatricians across the state have wanted to host these events for their local community so that you feel like you can ask questions to your local pediatrician. So we are lucky enough to have Dr. Josh Kantrowitz with us today. I'm going to mention a few things. In the meantime, I am going to manage the chat box. So I'll look at your questions and either answer them as they come up or leave them for Dr. Kantrowitz to answer when he's done with his presentation. We have Trudy Gilbert here with us today, who is an ASL interpreter. And I'm trying with my limited tech knowledge to make sure her video is spotlighted so that folks who need the ASL interpretation can see it. If you're having any difficulties, another option is to go to the right-hand corner of her video or any video that you want to see. There are these 3 blue dots. You can click on that and pin that video, and then that person who you've pinned, you'll be able to see. So that's another option. And then if you're having any challenges, please, put that in the chat box as well. So with that, we're so happy that you joined us. I know it's a really busy time. And, my kids, I have 2 little kids myself, and they're losing their minds downstairs. So hopefully there won't be too much chaos in the background. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Kantrowitz to get started.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming and participating. Great to see familiar faces in the crowd. And thanks again for Dr. Becca Bell being here. She was very modest in her introduction. A lot of you should know that she's been one of the point people during the COVID response in the state. And I think I've felt very lucky to be part of this state and a pediatrician in this state, as we've had a lot of direction and guidance from both the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Department of Health, and the Quality Improvement Program in Vermont, which is called VCHIP. And some of you may or may not know, we have a call 3 times a week where we get together with other pediatric providers and individuals who serve children throughout the state and talk about all things COVID, which has really helped us stay up to date on what's happening. And as you all know, as families in our community, things change quickly. From the advice to last week to this week, it is hard to keep your fingers on the pulse. And so having a group of really talented people together has been invaluable. I also wanted to point out that Dr. Kim Johnson, who's a OBGYN at NVRH, and many of you may know, is participating tonight. And I asked her to participate because, number 1, she may know a lot of you. Number 2, she and I share the distinction of having kids in this age group between 12 and 18 and having to go through the decision ourselves about whether we're going to vaccinate our kids and why that's important. And we share that responsibility of being parents with the responsibility of being clinicians in our community. And we certainly think that's important as we present this information to all of you. So moving on, I'm going to pull up a slideshow that has been developed by the AAP and VCHIP that really goes through and the Department of Health, that goes through some of the basic information around COVID, what's happening in our state right now around COVID, the vaccines, and you'll see Becca again in a short video where she talks about this vaccine and the age group specifically that we're talking about. And then we'll try to leave a good chunk of time at the end for questions. Please jump in on the chat box, like Dr. Bell said, and we'll make sure we get to everyone's questions. We plan to go through 8 o'clock tonight. All right, let me pull up the slideshow. All right, so I'll move forward, and I can always come back to things later if people feel like I've moved too quickly, but we'll start right in. How do I advance the slide? Oh, there we go. So the objectives for our evening. So a brief overview of COVID in children and Vermont. A reminder about our mental health concerns in children and adolescents. Many of you probably are fully aware that, as Becca has mentioned many times in the Vermont community, when she's presented either to the legislature or part of the press conferences held by the governor, that children are not okay. This has been a very tough year for youth in our community and around the world, around the country and around the world, and we see that every day at our office and throughout the state. There's the video that you'll see from Dr. Bell, and then information on the vaccine that I'll go over, and then we'll jump into questions and answers. So where are we at right now? As you can see, and you follow my little pointer here, this is the age group that generally we're involved in pediatrics. We have a group of now children between the age of 0 and 9. That number's about 1,700 who've gotten COVID-19, documented by a test. And then in the next age group up, another 3,641 individuals 10 to 19. You can see that the largest group certainly is the 20 to 30, and then moving on through the age groups. There's about a 50-50 split between females and males who've had COVID. We know that COVID has disproportionately affected individuals who are African American or Black, who are identify as Asian or Hispanic. And certainly you can see that in the breakdown over on the right side. When we look at what's happening with the cases among children in our state, you can follow along there. It's up to date as of 2 days ago. The overall number of cases is represented by the gray bars, and the cases of children is represented in the orange. We had seen generally from the beginning of April, moving to just last week, a steady decline in the number of infections. It's been about stable in the last week, but there's certainly been improvement since April, and that is a good thing. We also have seen a change in the way that the population has been getting infected. So we've seen an increase in the number of young people overall compared to older people, and that certainly reflects the fact that older individuals in the population are now by and large vaccinated. If you look in the age groups over 50, close to 90+% of the population has had at least one vaccine for COVID-19. And that's a real positive thing. It certainly drops off as we get below 30. This is the rate of infection in different age groups, and this is a rate per 10,000 individuals in the state. So you can see, as reflected in the last slide, that around the beginning of April, we certainly had a lot more identified cases of COVID in youth. And if you follow those different colored lines, you can see that elementary school is the blue, and that's the lowest rate. Then middle school being the purplish red, and then the green. I'm sure if I was better with my color identification, I'd give you more accurate descriptions of those colors, but those are the high school students, and that reflects what we know about national data, that it has been more likely for older youth to get infected with COVID than younger youth. So all of that brings us to the point about what's happening in the context of mental health for our youth. And this may be very close to home for many of you. It doesn't take many sort of steps away from your own personal household, probably, to identify a family who has suffered from significant anxiety or depression or other mental health issues related to the stresses of COVID. We hear frequently from young people that the isolation, especially in adolescence, and not being able to interact routinely with their peers has been very hard. And these are some quotes. This is, I can read through them, but starting there, we have Zoom, Google Meet, FaceTime. Sorry, I have to move my, I can see all of you, but it covers over the quotes. Let me try to close that for a second. So we have Zoom, Google Meet, FaceTime, and every other form of video service at our fingertips, but we don't have a true connection. There is no replacement for the smiles in the hallway, the feeling of winning playoff games, and the satisfaction of knowing the correct answer, certainly highlighting how important in-person school is. We want to be kids, but the pandemic has forced us to grow. We are still young, but we feel so aged by all we have been dealt. We want to cry about all we're missing, as we're still just kids trying to cope. But we also know that we are grateful for our health and safety. We feel guilty, relieved, and completely terrified. Lots of different emotions that I'm hearing from my patients every day. We're big kids. We can handle the truth, but also want our loved ones to hold us tight and tell us it will be all right. We miss our lives. We miss just being kids. So we'll move on to the video that Dr. Bell made. This is part of the presentation that's going to go out throughout the entire state. It takes a few minutes, but has wonderful details about what we want to present about why vaccination in youth is important, and also gets into some details about how the vaccines work. And what we've heard from lots of families is that's the data that matters. They really want to know what's the safety profile, how these vaccines function. And when we get to the end, certainly I can jump into more information about that, and we'll discuss in depth if anything is left for people to ask about. So here we go.
COVID-19 vaccine. Hi there, I'm Becca Bell. I'm a pediatrician in Burlington and the current president of the Vermont chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I'm just going to take a few moments to talk about how excited we are as pediatricians that the COVID-19 vaccine is available for young people now. So I'm a pediatric intensivist, which means I take care of children in the pediatric intensive care unit at UVM Children's Hospital. And I take care of infants, children, and adolescents who are critically ill or injured. And so vaccines are something that have always been really important to me because they help prevent a lot of the very serious illness I sometimes see in the ICU when children are too young or haven't been vaccinated against a vaccine preventable infection. And when I think back to last spring, when everything was shutting down and I was working with some of my other ICU colleagues who care for adults, and we were really worried about the number of ventilators and the number of hospital beds. If you had told me then a year ago that we would have a number of safe and effective vaccines that in trials, when tested on tens of thousands of people, prevented people from not just dying, but even becoming seriously ill enough to even be in the hospital, I don't know if I would have believed it. It's amazing how effective these vaccines are. And a lot of people are wondering, how are we able to get these vaccines so quickly? It seems like quite a feat. Josh, I think you have to unmute
when we
your.
test vaccines on other types of infections, usually those infections aren't as common, aren't as prevalent. And so it takes a while to get all that data. But with COVID-19, as we all know, the world stopped last spring, just completely stopped. And the biggest priority that everyone had in the world was stopping this virus. And what that meant really was having safe and effective vaccines. That became the top priority. And so every effort was turned towards that. All this funding was turned towards that. And a ton of collaboration happened in order to make this possible. So I want to talk a little bit about the vaccines that you all qualify for, are eligible for, or will be soon, and that's the messenger RNA vaccine. So that's the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So this is a technology that's been in use in cancer therapies, and also scientists have been using it to study vaccines for other infections. And so when the world was told what the SARS-CoV-2 virus looked like, that was something that was shared with everyone, people got to work. And so they used this technology that already existed, and they made it applicable to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And because there was so much funding going towards this, they were able to make this happen on a little bit of a quicker timeline than usual, but all the steps were there. They went through every single step. And because COVID-19 is so prevalent, when they did the efficacy trials to see if it worked, and they gave vaccine to some people and a placebo to other people, they saw very quickly that the people who received the vaccine weren't getting sick from COVID-19. And the people who didn't receive it were getting sick. And that data was collected so quickly that they were able to get a pretty definitive answer that these vaccines are really effective. And one thing that I think is so interesting about the mRNA vaccine is that it really gives your body instructions for how to make a protein that looks like what's on the virus. So what do I mean by that? So when you get the vaccine, this mRNA is like a little piece of instruction, or I almost think about it like a handwritten recipe that's sort of passed down in your family, right? You have a piece of paper with a recipe, and then these are instructions. And your cells can make, based on the instructions, can make a spike protein with that. Then once it's made, recipe goes away, and the mRNA, it just kind of disintegrates and disappears. And then what you have is this harmless spike protein that's not the virus, but is similar enough that your immune system can look at it, recognize it, and get ready for it in case they ever see the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And this is really important because this is what will stop the virus from replicating throughout your body if you're exposed to SARS-CoV-2 and making you very sick. And one of the things we know in intensive care medicine is that these viruses, SARS-CoV-2 in particular, the virus itself can cause a problem in your body. It can cause direct injury and illness. But the other problem is on the other end, when your immune system is trying to fight off that virus, that battle that happens can create a ton of inflammation and a lot of problems and a lot of illness. So it's that back and forth between it's the virus and your immune system. When you get exposed to the virus, when you get sick, that can make you really sick. Now, in someone who's been vaccinated, instead, their body sees the virus and their immune system's already ready. They already have the antibodies. They recognize it really quickly before the virus can kind of get out of hand. And they've got the cells ready that they know they need to fight off this virus. And that's why people aren't getting very sick. They're not dying. And if anything, they might have a mild cold after being vaccinated. And that is what's so amazing, is that these vaccines give your cells this recipe for how to create this spike protein. Your body then, your immune system then learns it, understands it, recognizes it, and gets ready for it. So when the first authorization happened, first with Pfizer in December, I was one of the lucky ones to get vaccinated pretty early. And as you can imagine, there were lines of doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers who were just so excited to get this vaccine. I mean, it was emotional. I felt emotional getting the vaccine for the first time, knowing that I was protecting my body. And then I got my second shot in January and had the expected, many people kind of feel crummy the next day because they have that, they can sense their immune system sort of recognizing again this spike protein and sort of revving up for it. And then felt fine after a day. And it's just been so amazing seeing my rest of my family and my friends and my colleagues and everyone I love getting vaccinated. My own children are too young right now. They don't qualify, but I am going to be so relieved and so grateful when the vaccines are approved for their age group, and they will be first in line. So I just wanted to spend a moment just to really let everyone know that, you know, we're living in this really, really challenging time. This virus has really wreaked havoc directly and indirectly, and it's affected all of us. But there is this really bright spot, and that is these vaccines they're really effective, and they're really doing what we want them to do, which is to keep us from getting sick. And we really want you to ask questions. If you have questions about the vaccine, we're here for you. Pediatricians are really excited that the people we love, our patients, are going to get vaccinated soon. And we're happy to walk you and your family through this process and work towards getting our communities healthy and getting back to doing all the stuff that we love doing. So thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to reach out to your pediatrician and reach out to us, and we're happy to work with you on this. Take care. Hi there, I'm Becca Bell.
Sorry if I muted everybody for a second there. I thought I was going to mute myself so that you could listen to Becca, and I think I turned her off for a second, so I apologize. So just to be clear, and everyone knows from where I'm sitting, my daughter got vaccinated today, Willa Kantrowitz, and she is just about 14. We have had this conversation in our household for months about what would happen when the vaccine was approved. And, you know, in our case, Willa came to us and said, please sign me up as soon as possible. And I think that really has come down to the fact that we've talked a lot about vaccines, and she knows my perspective on vaccines, but she's also very inquisitive and had a lot of questions for us. But for her, a huge part of it was, when can I start doing things with my friends and my peers that I have not been able to do? And she has been thirsty for that for a long time. And so this was, to a certain degree, a passport moving forward towards being able to do more of the things that she really wants to do, partly because she knows how it might affect her if she got COVID. There is some risk, certainly, to youth, and we can go into that as we move forward. But she also knows how it could affect if she brought COVID to someone else, including her two sets of grandparents who are both in their 80s. And so, you know, this has been an important decision for us. So right here, why vaccinate your teen? Well, you know, this is some of the publicity going out from around the country. But, you know, number one for pediatricians is we want kids to be safe. We want kids to be healthy. But we know a huge part of that is getting them back to the things that they are doing in their lives. And that includes school, that includes sports, it includes arts, it includes music, it includes clubs, it includes just spending quality time with the people that they love, whether they be friends or family. You know, you can see over here on the right side, talking about moving beyond quarantine, getting more freedom in our lives, being less worried about getting infected and infecting other people. So you probably have lots of questions about the vaccines. I'll run through these slides and then we'll get to your questions. So one of the vaccines, the one that we're talking about right now, or we generally will talk about tonight, the Pfizer vaccine, was originally approved back in December. I think it was December 11th, for 16 and above, based upon the research. And then we've moved forward to the group of 12 to 15-year-olds as of May 12th. So how do COVID vaccines work? Well, Dr. Bell already spoke about this to a certain degree. There's a lot of similarity to how other vaccines have worked over the long history of vaccine research. It gives our immune system an opportunity to recognize something, whether it looks like the individual disease that we're trying to prevent against, or a attenuated form, meaning not a very active form of that disease, so that our immune system is ready the next time it sees the real disease. Those different diseases like COVID-19 invade and multiply inside the body. The vaccine stops this by helping the immune system make special proteins called antibodies that help fight off the virus, and helps our immune system, the white blood cells, recognize for the future what to do when it sees the virus. After your vaccination, you have less of a chance of getting COVID-19. So far from the research, that chance is very, very low. You know, the study that looked at COVID-19 vaccination, the Pfizer vaccination in groups 12 to 15, had a 0% chance of getting COVID-19 in the studied group. The likelihood that as we vaccinate everybody, that it will be 100% protective is unlikely. Most vaccines don't function that way. But getting that initial research that said that you know, no individuals that were vaccinated in that age group got COVID-19 was very reassuring. If we do get infected with the virus, like many vaccines, what we find is that people may not be as sick as they would be if they were without the vaccine. So there are 3 different vaccines that are currently approved in the United States. They've all gotten emergency use authorizations, and 2 require 2 doses. That's the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. The Pfizer is 3 weeks between the 2 shots, and the Moderna is 4. The Pfizer vaccine's the only one currently authorized for youth up to 18, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is the only shot that can be given as a single shot and does not need a booster. The one-shot vaccine was paused. Many of you probably know this from following the news, looking at the risks of very rare blood clots that were reported in people who had gotten the vaccine. These were generally in young women in their 20s to 40s. The pause ended when data confirmed the chance of developing those clots was very, very rare, and the risk was very low. The discussion among the Federal Drug Administration really revolved around the benefits and the risks, and it was determined that the available data showed that the vaccine's known potential benefits outweighed its known risks in people 18 years of age and older. So how effective are vaccines? All of the vaccines seem to be very, very effective. And they seem to be both effective at stopping you from getting COVID-19. They also, and this is one of the most important details that we've been talking about throughout the vaccine conversation, is that they're almost universally effective at preventing serious illness and hospitalization and death. And that has been remarkably demonstrated through the data on older individuals who've been vaccinated. We don't know how long immunity from the vaccine will protect people, and we're going to have to follow that research out as we move forward. So many people have asked, is one type of vaccine better than the others? All three vaccines are safe and effective at preventing severe illness and death. We can't directly compare each one because they haven't been studied side by side or against each other, but each clinical trial had different study protocols, timing, and location, but we do have research about each individual vaccine. We do know that the variants that we've been talking about in the news for a while now, weeks to months, were not widely circulating when many of the vaccines were tested. But we do have data that's coming in from people getting vaccinated now that the vaccines are generally quite effective even against many of the variants. The side effects are quite similar across the different vaccines. And as Dr. Bell mentioned, these are generally side effects that tell us our body is responding to the vaccine appropriately. Our immune system is getting revved up and protecting us. And I noted that I had pretty sore arm during both of my Moderna vaccines, and on my second vaccine, the next morning I woke up with headache and felt crummy for about 4 hours, and then I was fine. How do we know vaccines are safe for youth? COVID-19 vaccines are safe in adults and in the studies for children, youth 12 and up. We don't have trials or vaccines yet for kids younger than this, but they're happening right now, and they're happening from 6 months up. There were tens of thousands of volunteers in the vaccine studies, and now we have millions of vaccines that have been given, and we have pooled data on the side effects and outcomes from that vaccination process. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say that the COVID-19 vaccines will have the most intensive safety monitoring in U.S. history. And, I think this is somewhat obvious from the era that we live in, right? We have so much media at our fingertips day to day, and we have everyone with a smartphone in their hand. And if you got your COVID vaccine, you recognize that you were given some information about an app you could use, or a resource that you could use to actually report your side effects. And so we have pooled data from millions of people who've gotten vaccinated to see how they're responding to the vaccines. What about side effects from the vaccine? So some people don't have any side effects. And I would say we did a little micro poll here in our office, and maybe a quarter had no symptoms. Probably, another half of our group had some mild symptoms, and like a sore arm or feeling headachy. And then a few had fevers, and that fit with the general data. We know so far that kids 12 and above have about the same reported side effects as the adults in the studies. And the most common one is certainly local pain, but then fever, chills, headache, fatigue, nausea, and muscle or joint pain. Generally, those symptoms resolve within 24 hours. It takes about 2 weeks after your second dose of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, or 2 to 4 weeks after the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, to be considered fully vaccinated and protected from the vaccine. Vaccines are free, whether or not you have health insurance. So the clinical trial that was looked at for the Pfizer vaccine in young people, 12 to 15, showed that the vaccine was safe and effective. As I mentioned, 0% of the kids in the actual group that got the vaccine got COVID, which is stellar. There were about 1,200, there were over 1,000 kids in each arm, so meaning the vaccinated group versus the placebo group. And the clinical trials are starting for young children, as we talked about now. There's been pretty clear recommendation, there is a clear recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices that you can get other vaccines around the time that you get the COVID vaccine, and that's what we're recommending for youth from our office. And then, I think the important part in terms of moving forward with vaccine is that Vermont is live with the ability to get your kids signed up and vaccinated. You can register through the Department of Health, and if you Google or go to the Department of Health website, it is front and center. It talks right there as you pull up the website about vaccinating kids 12 and above, and you can make appointments for youth to get vaccinated. That's happening locally, and we can get into that a little bit later, but at our local schools, also at the mall here in St. Johnsbury. And down the road, although we're not there yet, we may be giving vaccines in our individual offices, including at our office here. So right here, the best way to guarantee a dose is to register in advance. Everyone can register now if you're 12 or above. You could even register your child if they're younger, but you have to wait to actually schedule them until they've gotten to their birthday and become 12. So for instance, my son is only 11, but he'll be 12 this summer, and we're registering him so that then when he's able to get vaccinated, we can sign him up for one of the clinics. Parents or guardians can add their children as their dependents, so you can log on with your own information, and you can schedule an appointment at a school clinic or one of the other community clinics. There is a consent process. Certainly for any individual under 18, they need a guardian's approval and consent to get the vaccine. If it's not possible to do the registration through the internet, there is the number there as well, that call center, which is, we can certainly get that information out into the community, but if you want to, if you can see it right there now, you can certainly write it down and then register in that way. We're trying to make sure that everyone has access to registration, whether you have internet access or computer access. And just lastly, in terms of school clinics, some clinics may provide some walk-in doses. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later, but you still would need to have a parent or guardian with them to provide consent. There is some conversation about phone consent, so that if there is a youth at the school and they're available to get vaccinated, we need to be able to contact a parent. So schools will be provided a permission form that parents, guardians can use to give consent, and that can be accessed in multiple languages. And then, as I mentioned there, phone access is possible for consent. These are the resources for the information that we presented tonight. And we're going to move forward here into the question and answer component of our evening.
Josh, thank you so much. I can let you catch your breath and kind of summarize a little bit about what's going on in the chat and have you respond. I answered a few questions. I did actually want to start not quite in order, but wanted to address probably, or definitely the most common question we're getting from parents is about seeing concerns or hearing concerns about whether or not the vaccine can affect fertility and affect the process of puberty. So that's been a really common question. So I'm getting a lot of parents who say they got vaccinated themselves, but just want to make sure it's the right choice for their child. I'll say a few thoughts that I have and then hand it over to Dr. Kantrowitz so he can sort of take a break for a second. So, you know, when as a parent, you just want to make the best choice for your child. So this is a very reasonable question to ask. And in fact, it's so reasonable that it's come up before with other vaccines. So we give other vaccines during this age group. And there have been questions in the past from families like, can this vaccine affect puberty can affect fertility. And so I will say that other vaccines that we've had in place that we give to this age group that we've been giving for years and years and years and years and years, we've never seen it affect fertility or puberty. The other thing I think about, going back to science education, is what is the mechanism by which this would happen? And so there isn't really a biological reason why this vaccine would affect puberty or why it would affect fertility. And so when we talk about these vaccines and trying to be reassuring about it, one of the things that I try to focus on is that, there isn't a real mechanism by which it would really affect puberty. So remembering that for these vaccines, you have this set of instruction that will then have the cell create a spike protein that looks like the virus, but this mRNA, the instructions never enter the nucleus of the cell, never get into anywhere near where the DNA is in the cell. So it makes instructions for the spike protein in a controlled way so that then your immune system can then get ready and prepare for an eventual exposure of the virus. So I'm gonna let Josh speak about this too, and Dr. Johnson, if Dr. Johnson wants to weigh in as well too, because this is I'm glad we're focusing on this because this is a question that keeps coming up.
Yeah, so some of the people who are probably listening in tonight have had conversations with me about vaccines here in the office, and I think everyone here knows that before COVID-19, certainly that was a conversation that I was really open to having because we've had that conversation at my house. My wife is very happy for me to present this, but she, from early on, has been somewhat of a vaccine skeptic. And that has to do with the fact that she comes from a family where they use a lot of complementary medicine. And there had been a lot of questions growing up for her family about whether allopathic medical practices were safe. I come from a household where my dad's an internal medicine doctor. My mom was a pediatric nurse, and she took care of kids who suffered from polio. And she was 100% in when, I was young talking about vaccines. So we came from very different perspectives thinking about vaccines. And so I like having this conversation because we have this conversation at my house about safety around vaccines. And I think one of the big pieces around vaccine is knowing that when you decide to vaccinate your children, like Dr. Bell said, you're making a choice to do something, and making that choice could be risky. And you never want to do anything to your child that would hurt them. And so it becomes a conversation around the potential risk of the vaccine and the potential risk of the disease that they could get. And certainly where I come down on most vaccine conversations is the risk of the illness, at least we know this with COVID-19, certainly outweighs the risk of what we know about the vaccine and those side effects that are transient. I tried to figure out where the big conversation around fertility came from, and Dr. Johnson might be able to jump in on this a little bit better. But when I went through all of the sources that I could find, and most of those were going through the internet trying to figure out where the concern came from around fertility, I found that it sounded like there was a few individuals in Europe who raised the question of whether the spike protein, which is made by the vaccine, the mRNA, could look like a protein that's on the placenta. And that if that was true, would it be possible that if your immune system was trying to fight off this spike protein, could it also fight off the placenta for a developing baby? And what I think is really important to recognize is that when you start listening to scientists who do fertility work all the time, they're very clear that these are two very different things, and they do not look alike at all. It's one of the analogies was that if you have a phone number with 7 numbers in it, and one of the numbers is the same, 2 different numbers, that's about as close as they get. And so that there is not very similar at all. And number 2 is that when you look at the data of all the people who have got COVID, the illness itself, one would think that their immune system would do the exact same thing. It would see that spike protein and it would fight off those same markers in a placenta. And what we know, and I'll pass the mic on to Dr. Johnson here, but is that it does not appear that getting COVID-19 has a major effect on your fertility rate. Plus, we found that during the studies on the vaccine itself, that women were getting pregnant during the vaccine trials. So it has not been clear that the vaccine affects fertility from my reading. But I will pass it on to Dr. Johnson if she's willing to say a few words about it.
Yep, I would actually absolutely agree with that. And that was very well spoken and said. So we don't have any data to suggest that there's an impact negatively on fertility. The puberty aspect, same thing. The proteins that are developed from the vaccination look nothing like anything that we would be concerned about with fertility. And in fact, when the vaccine first came out, we were also recommending vaccination for those women who are pregnant, regardless of gestational age. And so I think that's a really important statement. You know, fertility and obstetric care is at the core of what we do every single day. And so we would never recommend something that we thought would negatively impact pregnancy or fertility, even if it is good for the greater good. And so even within our own practice, we have folks, nurses and providers who are currently pregnant who jumped right into the vaccine as well. So no hesitation whatsoever. And so we think it is safe and effective and important, especially knowing the impacts that this disease has on the women of childbearing age and the rest of the communities. So we're all for it.
And you know, I think one of the things that's always brought to light here, I had mentioned this debate around the pro of the vaccine and the risk of the disease. I think it's been pretty clear, Dr. Johnson, right, that the risk of getting COVID when you are pregnant has been demonstrated in study after study.
Yep, and that data was we didn't know at the very beginning of this, a little over a year ago, was what was the impact, and we just did not see that many pregnant women develop COVID. And now that we've been through this for over a year, and we're looking at data not only in this country, but elsewhere, we know that women don't do as well who have COVID in pregnancy. And in fact, we're actually recommending monoclonal antibody therapy for those women who are pregnant and symptomatic in order to try to prevent the bad sequelae, which are increased rates of ventilation, increased rates of ICU stay, and increased rates of preterm and premature deliveries. And so we know that moms don't do as well when they get COVID and are pregnant. So whatever we can do to prevent that is super helpful. And I know in this population, in our adolescents, it seems far away, but it's really right around the corner when we're talking 12 to 17-year-olds.
Thank you both for that. Some of the questions are coming just to me, so I'm gonna read some of those out. This is along the same line, so I'm gonna go to this one next. What about the unknown long-term unforeseen effects? Have there been issues with side effects that show up years down the road with vaccines? And that's a great question too. And what we know so far with all of the vaccines that we give in childhood and adulthood, they're followed really closely. And side effects or issues show up sometimes in the moments right after the vaccine, if someone has an allergy to one of the components, or within a few days to a few weeks. And there haven't been any side effects of other vaccines that have shown up like years down the road. And I know that's just one of the concerns as a parent is like, I'm making this decision. I don't want to regret it years down the road. And so again, we haven't seen that with other vaccines, and there's a lot of thought going into what's the biologic mechanism by which this could cause problems, and there's nothing we can really come up with that we worry about in terms of this type of thing, like development, puberty, fertility. And I don't know if either of you want to add more to that. I think just to speak to the I don't know, what if something happens down the line, to speak to that concern and fear?
Yeah, I mean, this is one that I find that we talk about all the time in the office. And just to go back to something that Dr. Bell wrote a number of months ago, that was, I can't remember where it was published, Dr. Bell, but it was an online forum. And I think one of the things that you said was that we as humans struggle with the ability to calculate risk effectively. And I don't say that in a way where I'm discounting any of the concerns that families have. But what I mean to say is that we tend to get pretty comfortable with things that are routine. And I use this analogy all the time in my conversations around vaccine, and you used it in your article, which was about driving, that we get in our car every day and we make the decision to drive places because we need to. I need to get to work. I think that's important for my family, my patients, and so forth. I want my kids to get to activities, like I want them to get to school. I want them to get to sports. I want them to get to arts programs and things that they really care about. I travel, hours to Massachusetts so that they can see their grandparents. And I feel those things are really valuable. It is the most dangerous thing I do every day is get in my car. The statistics say that if there is something that it would be better for me to walk down the street. It would be better for me to do anything else than get in my car, because riding in my car is very risky. But I need to make a decision about the balance of pro and con in my life. And when I look at vaccines, I'll just be very honest. We don't know if 20 years down the road, there could be some identified risk from a vaccine, but the hypothesis and the theory around vaccine, because vaccines are not new. They've been around for hundreds. I mean, well, the research on vaccine goes way back over 100 years. And then, you have vaccination that goes back to Edward Jenner, who is vaccinating kids with cowpox against smallpox. That goes back far longer than that. And we know that vaccine works. And we know that overall, in the grand scheme of things, it is one of the most influential things we've done to keep kids safe. When you think about what Dr. Bell does every day, she takes care of remarkably sick individuals in an intensive care unit with very serious illnesses. And before the age of vaccine, I always use my colleagues as an example, because they all trained 20 years before me. They all claim that they were doing lumbar punctures and blood cultures on 2 to 4 kids a night. In my training, I can count on these hands how many times I did a lumbar puncture, because with the vaccinations against pneumococcal disease and Hib, we have essentially eliminated some of the severe cases of meningitis and sepsis that were present just a few decades earlier. So, one off on a tangent there, but my point there was to say that we have a huge history of vaccination that has shown that vaccinations are overall very safe. And in the balance of pro to con, we have found that we have eliminated the risk of so many diseases. And it appears that right now, the data we have on the COVID-19 vaccine is showing us more efficacy, more effective treatment or prevention than the majority of the other vaccines that we have, which is remarkably exciting from the kind of vaccine pediatrician nerd guy here. So that's how I tend to think about it. I also do feel a lot of safety in what Dr. Bell was saying about vaccines being monitored closely. There have been very rare but identified side effects from some vaccines over time, and those have been identified very quickly by the observational systems that are in place. And when that's true, like the blood clot case with the J&J vaccine, it's brought to light, and there was a discussion about how to sort of adjust or change those vaccinations. And so I'm always feeling very confident in the fact that those kinds of things have been picked up over time in research when we're looking for them.
Yeah, thank you. And to piggyback a little bit on this, somebody asked about, or somebody mentioned just medicine's not great history on being transparent and really inhumane practices on and people with disability, people of different races, and that existed, and that's a terrible. And we still have health inequity that occurs in this country and elsewhere. So, so yes, that is definitely a part of medicine's history. I do feel very confident in the way that these vaccines are monitored, and I do take that the J&J. I mean, to me, that was something that was picked up because so many people are getting the vaccine that you can start to pick up things that are happening in 1 in a million. And the fact that they stopped and said, hold on, we got to take a look at this. To me, that, you know, as a parent, as a pediatrician, that's very reassuring that we're getting lots of data, that the data is being taken seriously. And the fact is that like everyone in the world is getting vaccinated. And so this is not, I mean, I give so many medications to kids that it's like a handful of people have gotten. And so, you know, when parents ask me about it, it's like, we have some data, but not a ton, but this is something that lots and lots and lots of people are getting. And I do want to remind folks that 16 and up with the Pfizer vaccine has been studied for about a year now, right? Because they were approved, 16, 17, 18-year-olds were approved back in December, which means they were getting the vaccine last spring as part of the trials. So, you know, that age group has been followed now for more than a year in those trials too, which I think is a helpful thing to remember. Josh, another person asked, if a child were to get COVID after being vaccinated, are they able to pass it to others, or does the vaccine protect against that?
So we don't know. The honest answer is that there are breakthrough, quote unquote, breakthrough cases of people who get COVID when they've been vaccinated. The state has been monitoring this in people who are over the age of 16 who've gotten the vaccine. The rates of breakthrough are under 1%. They're very few, but no vaccine is 100%. And so there are going to be people who get COVID. What we do know is that the people who get COVID who've been vaccinated, so far from that research, have less symptoms, like we said, are less likely to get very sick. And it seems that, well, when the vaccine first was approved, we weren't sure if they were less likely to be asymptomatic and pass on the virus. But now we do know that if you're vaccinated, you are less likely to pass on the virus to other people. So we don't know because we don't have enough data yet on the 12 to 15 or 16-year age group. But we would assume, based upon the data that's been found so far in older individuals, that it is less likely once you get the vaccine, if I'm answering your question correctly, that even if you were asymptomatic, you would be less likely to pass on the vaccine to other people. Does that square up with what you know, Dr. Bell?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're having just much more reassuring data, which is why we're seeing this change in masking, because people are feeling much more confident that, the vaccine really protects you from getting infected. It protects you from the virus replicating through your body and making you potentially more contagious. But there are going to be cases of breakthrough infection. When you have a big population like this, there are going to be some people who can still get COVID. I'm going to stay on and make sure I answer questions. So I know it's 8 o'clock, but hopefully we can hang on for a few more minutes to make sure people get their questions answered. What about folks who've had COVID infection? So my son was positive with COVID-19, had very mild symptoms in March. Should he still get vaccinated? If yes, how long should we wait for him to get his vaccine?
We do think that people should get vaccinated who have had COVID, and Dr. Bell, you can back me up on this if you know something different, but we do not have, so we know that once you've had the virus, you probably have some protection. Currently, we average that data to say that you might have protection for 3 months or so, and you're considered to be protected during that period of time. But it does not seem like it's a bad idea to get vaccinated once you've got the virus. So we would recommend that as soon as you feel comfortable having your child get vaccinated, that would be appropriate.
I'm sorry, I will look this up, but I think it's 3 weeks. They want you to wait at least 3 weeks until, so if your child had it in March, they should be fine to get it now, to get the vaccine now, even if they had the infection. Okay, what about, I do want to go back to the question about a child with Down syndrome who's 9 years old and is unable to wear a mask. And so is unable to get vaccinated right now, is unable to wear a mask. And I'm wondering if the person, if Rylan is still on and wants to, if you want to unmute and ask your question, I'm guessing this might be a little bit around the new masking guidelines and perhaps being worried about that. So feel free, I answered a little bit in the chat, but if you have more questions, feel free to unmute or type more into the chat box. Another question from Danielle, do you think COVID vaccine will become part of our annual vaccination routine like the flu shot? Danielle, if you know, like that's the $1 million question right now. And Josh, I don't know if you want to take more of this, but I think that's kind of the big question is how often we're going to need to get the get boosters.
So many of you have probably, if you follow the news, heard that we're thinking about COVID-19, which we've talked about as a pandemic, possibly becoming an endemic disease, meaning that it will live with us kind of like the flu does. And if you were to compare it with the virus that you know well, or probably know somewhat about the flu, the reason we get a vaccine every year for the flu is because that virus itself has the tendency to mutate easily. So it has a lot of genetic variability, and so every year it can look a bit different. We don't think, and I'm not a virologist, but we don't think that COVID can mutate as efficiently as the flu. But we all know, if we follow the news, that COVID does mutate because there have been some variants. And the answer to Danielle's question is that it depends on, and this would be the research that we'll be gathering, not we, the people who do this research will be gathering over the coming months, as to how effective the current vaccines are at protecting against the variants that come out. If we find out that the vaccine is less effective at protecting against more of the predominant variants, then my guess will be that there will be a development of a booster that helps prevent the transmission and the contagion from those variants, like we see each year with the flu shot, if that answers the question. I was going to say, one thing that's really interesting or fascinating about the mRNA vaccines from the science cool part is that it is a vaccine that can be developed more efficiently and can be changed more efficiently to create a new version or a booster, which I think is one of the things that have a lot of scientists really excited about the mRNA technology as we move forward, just to throw out a little sidebar there.
So you mentioned 1,000 children in each arm of the Pfizer study. How many children ages 12 to 15 have now had the Pfizer vaccine? So let's see, I feel like last week has been like 10 years long. But, you know, we just started, I mean, even in Vermont, I think we've had thousands of children in this age group sign up. I can pull up the number now, but across the country, I mean, we've probably in the last week have had tens of thousands of young people get it. I don't know, Josh, if you have specific numbers in your head.
I don't know. I mean, I wish I did. And, you know, we can get that data back to people if they're interested. I don't know in real time. We'd have to go to one of the tracking sites that tracks vaccination. And the Vermont, you know, I did want to bring up the point about this when people are curious about data and the transparency of the medical community. There's a lot of reason to be skeptical about the medical community based upon the history of medicine. One of the things that I've loved about being a pediatrician in Vermont is that if you go to the Vermont Department of Health website and you want information on COVID vaccine and COVID in Vermont, you can get the data up to the last few days. And if you go through the website and you look for that data, it's available. And I think the state has done their best to be as transparent as possible. So I'll just throw that out. That data is not hard to find, and I'm sure it will be available in the next few days on the Department of Health website if you're curious about that age group and vaccination.
And I'll add one, nobody has really specifically asked this, but I feel like, you know, one of the general thoughts is, you know, kids don't get as sick from COVID as adults. And just again, thinking about risks and benefits and, you know, how strongly do we feel as pediatricians that kids should get this vaccine? And I think we've all said we're recommending it to our patients. I'm going to get my kids vaccinated when they can. Josh has had his child vaccinated. And I'll just share a little bit about what I worry about with COVID-19. And that is, it's just really hard to know. We know that there are risk factors with certain underlying health conditions where somebody can get more sick. But then there are also just people who get sick, and it's sort of surprising. And I will say that from personal experience, every year I take care of kids who get a common virus. And for whatever reason, they're totally healthy kids. They have this very strong immune inflammatory response, and they get very, very sick from it. And you've probably heard a little bit about something called a multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which is the acronym is MIS-C. And that's something that we are seeing although we haven't seen it much in Vermont. It is something in the populations where lots of kids are getting this. There are a few kids who have this really strong inflammatory response, and that can cause some organ injury. And it's just, if we have enough kids who are getting it, we're going to have some kids who get this sort of response. And what I love about the vaccine, and I've been thinking about ways to describe what's actually happening in your body, is that it's sort of like you would never sign yourself or your kid up for a marathon and like never train and just be like, all right, I don't know, don't plan for this, just start this race, don't prep for it, don't have water, don't have snacks, just go out and run it, right? You might like go out too slow and be way behind, or you might go out too fast and have to stop the race. The vaccine prepares your immune system to be totally ready. It has like all the cells ready. And so it's sort of like dropping someone off at like mile marker 24 to like finish the race. So all of that, what I see in the ICU, and I sort of tried to explain it in the video, is sometimes it's not so much just the virus, it's your body's reaction to the virus. And that's really causing the problem. And it's hard to know, you know, who is going to have that response. And with the COVID vaccine, your body is not surprised and shocked by this virus. It's already ready. It's got the cells ready. And that's what makes me feel really reassured by it, is that I want my own kids to have just the way we teach and guide our kids and prepare them for things like that, their body would be prepared and ready for the virus, and makes it much less likely that they'll have that huge immune inflammatory response that then can create a lot of problems. So that's the way I think about it. You know, even though we've done really well in Vermont with kids not getting horribly sick from COVID-19, there is still definitely that risk that they could have a severe either respiratory illness or severe sort of immune multi-system inflammatory response. And that to me definitely makes it worth it to get the vaccine. I think we've had answered all the questions. Josh, do you have any parting words?
I was just reviewing the chat box, and I think you spoke to this, but you know, we don't always talk about this, and I know that the reasons that we vaccinate our children are and ourselves vary based upon the individual. But I do want to highlight the response you had to the individual who asked about the child with Down syndrome and maybe not being able to wear a mask. And I do see vaccination as, and some people would find this to be a politically sensitive statement, but I do see vaccination as one way that we protect our community and the people who are most vulnerable in our community. And in our schools, we certainly have a lot of young people who may not be able to wear masks or may not be able to protect themselves as easily as some of the other individuals in school. And I do take that as a serious responsibility when I decide myself about vaccination, and here in our office, we've been wearing masks and doing all the things that we really feel are important in preventing spread. And that's been partly to prevent ourselves from getting sick, but also recognizing that we see so many kids every day and that we're always worried about if we would pass on the virus to somebody else as well. And I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of us decided to get vaccinated here in the office, not only for our own safety and protection, but knowing that we interface with the community every day and we want to make sure that our community is safe and healthy. And again, everyone vaccinates for different reasons, but I just wanted to point that out around that question of the individual who asked the question about the child with Down syndrome, because we do see that as an important process and reason for vaccination. Everyone who's participated, and I also want to point out in the chat box that I think Stephanie Winters, who was responsible for setting this all up, I think put the links into the Department of Health website where the data is available on vaccination. So if people are interested, there's the real-time answer that I did not have and Dr. Bell didn't have. But thank you all for participating, whoever joined us tonight. I will say that our phones were off the hook today at our office with questions about vaccine, and I know that there'll be more questions. So one of the big questions that came up that I just want to end with was around if you have had any allergic symptoms or if you have a food allergy. That was the biggest question on our phone today. And the recommendations are that if you have a food allergy, especially one that has the need for something like an epinephrine pen to protect yourself, that the recommendation is still to get vaccinated. You need to wait for 30 minutes after you get vaccinated. You should bring your EpiPen, but there is not clear data that if you have something like a food allergy that you're at any more risk for having a severe allergic reaction than anybody else. If you have had an allergic reaction to an individual vaccine, that's not the COVID vaccine, that's a longer conversation and we need to talk with you and talk possibly with an allergist. And then if you've had an allergic reaction to a COVID vaccine, which I'm not sure there's anyone in this group tonight who may fit that category, but that's also a conversation, and that will require more discussion. So general allergies and food allergies, even if you had an EpiPen, the vaccine appears to be safe, and you should still plan on getting vaccinated if that's already in your plans.
One last question, Josh, if you could speak to this, is a question about the social awkwardness about potentially asking other families or people if they've been vaccinated or if their child has been vaccinated. And so I haven't done actually too much thinking about this, and I don't know if folks have ways that they ask. I think one way is you can say, "Oh, I got my second shot. I'm going to be immune on this day. I'd love to hang out with other folks. Like, let me know what day that is for you." That might make things a little bit less awkward. I don't know if you have other thoughts or anyone's shared with you how they've navigated. I mean, I'm sure it depends on the relationship you have with the person, but if you have any words of wisdom around that, navigating that conversation.
Wow, that is such a good question, and one that I struggle with my own kids. I think, Becky, you've been a leader in this area about injury prevention. I've had conversations with you about this before, but it may almost come down to, in a community like ours, some other topics that are here well before COVID. We talk about gun safety and prevention. We talk about water safety and prevention, drowning, things like that. And I have conversations with families all the time about, well, if you have your child go do a play date, are the guns locked at their household? And how do you have that conversation with the family in Vermont, where guns are so prevalent and part of our culture? Hunting is a big part of our culture. And, there may be families like my family who, I don't know anything about hunting, but some of my kids' best friends hunt all the time. And how do we have that conversation? And they're hard conversations to have. I think that what I come back to is I usually just use my own personal feelings about it when I start the conversation and say, hey, this is something that I realize may be a hard conversation. I just put it right out there at the beginning and say, but safety around guns is really important to me. And I just want to be able to have that conversation before our kids go over to your house. Are your guns, locked, or are they in a safe place? And I certainly make it more about myself because it's an important thing to me. And those are hard conversations to have, but that might be the same model for having the conversation around COVID vaccine. I certainly, my kids have struggled more, I think, than not struggled, but just this weekend, my daughter and I had a conversation about this. She was frustrated about not being able to do something. And I said, we're not at a state yet where you can do this based upon state regulations. And it was frustrating. But, I said that coming back to kind of protecting the community and protecting individuals that are at higher risk, this is something we need to continue to do. And we had that hard conversation right at our house. Well, another long-winded answer, but I think that's part of how I'd start. I don't know. What do anyone else have any ways that they would think about doing that?
I always say, like, put the onus on somebody or something else. So exactly what Josh says, like, oh, we're following the guidelines really carefully, or the other piece, and this is true, it's extremely, health stuff aside, it's extremely inconvenient to get COVID, right? Like, you have to quarantine, you can't go to school. Or if even if you don't get COVID, but you're exposed to COVID, can't go to school, right? So if you want to kind of deflect, if it's going to be awkward, say, we don't want to do anything that might jeopardize her ability to go to school. And so we're being really careful about COVID exposure and we're following the guidelines. So again, like, you can kind of shift this off of you a little bit. And then I think, always sharing your own personal information about where you're at can help open up the conversation for other people to add. But it's tricky. It's not super straightforward. Yeah, or you just straight up ask.
Yeah, some of the families that we've talked to throughout the pandemic, right, having someone get exposed or get COVID has had a huge impact on school participation, but also on the financial status of the family. I mean, so many families have not been able to work for 1 to 2 weeks or more at a time, and that's a huge impact on everyone in our community. So, one of the things we've talked about COVID and all the things that we do to try to prevent transmission, including vaccine, for a long time, is helping our society get back to a place where we can get kids to school and people doing, I mean, in my other part of my life, I'm on the board of an arts organization in our area, and like, I miss going to a concert. I miss going and listening to great music. I miss going to an art studio and seeing great art. And that's, my wife's a photographer. There's just so many things that we have not been able to do. And it's a great point to bring it back to kind of helping our entire society move forward so that we can get back to the things that are meaningful to us.
Yes, thanks. I was just adding, it's always helpful for us to hear what conversations you're having with folks and what works, because we like to pass that info along if it's working for you. So thanks for sharing. I think we're caught up with the chat, Josh, and thank you all so much for not just joining, but sticking with us this whole time. And you know how to find Josh. I will also put my email in here. And yeah, if no one else has any other questions, then we'll call it a night. Start to tackle bedtime.
Thank you all so much. And thanks to the AAP and VCHIP and the Department of Health. I mean, just been remarkable support for us over here in Caledonia County. And thank you for all of you participating families who are here tonight. Appreciate it.